Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. The Puritan English minister Roger Williams founded the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Let's travel back with Eric Yanis of the Other States of America podcast to learn more about this remarkable time in North American history.
Roger Williams, known famously as the founder of Rhode Island, planned in coordination with the natives to make a colony of his own, which would be a refuge to anyone searching for freedom of conscience and willing to live peaceably. Slowly, they put together this compact or combination to govern themselves, and in some ways it was extremely revolutionary. For one thing, it makes no mention of God whatsoever. There would be in Providence a strict separation of church and state. All landowning men would be able to vote, which in Massachusetts and Connecticut at this time, you had to be a church member in order to earn any level of suffrage. There was also no mandatory church attendance, also something the Puritan colonies liked to enforce. And there was no mandatory church attendance because there was no mandatory church. There was no state church. There was no sanctioned church. There was no state-approved church, any way you want to say it. On this matter, Roger Williams said, "In a sense of God's merciful providence unto me in my distress, called the place Providence. I desired it might be a shelter for persons distressed for conscience." And putting all things religious and civil aside, Roger Williams had to set up a way to make a living for himself. Well, the Narragansett gave him choice property for a trading post, which especially in this early period would serve to be the main source of his income, and possibly one of the ventures that Governor Winthrop invested in. This business connection between the two men is important because it kept Providence safer, having leading men in Massachusetts invested in it. But the Narragansett alone did not have a huge supply of furs. Even by the 1630s, the elusive beaver, which created the most desirable pelt and so went for the most money back in Europe, were becoming quite scarce. And so while Rogers could depend on furs for a good chunk of his income, it wouldn't be the mainstay of the entire Providence colony. The people of Providence learned to raise livestock. Many times they would deposit a herd on a small island in Narragansett Bay, protected from predators, without even having to build a fence. And around this time, 1637 and 1638, the largest of these islands, known by several names, but the one you would recognize as Rhode Island, was of particular interest to a group of people in Massachusetts still, who were also dissidents and were also facing banishment. Roger Williams welcomed them to the area, and then he facilitated the sale of Rhode Island to this group from the Narragansett. Roger Williams had no governance over this group. They were simply friendly neighbors in a similar situation. And so there is no Rhode Island and Providence Plantations yet. There's no unity whatsoever. In fact, this group that settled Rhode Island, they founded the settlement of Portsmouth on the north side of the island. But within a year or two, they had split in half, and one faction went to the south side of the island and founded Newport. And so now we have Providence, Newport, and Portsmouth, all living under separate compacts. This would be the same era of time where Roger Williams plays a small but critical part in the Pequot War. An Englishman was killed on Block Island by a bunch of natives. The authorities in Massachusetts were convinced that it was committed by the Narragansett, and they were inclined to attack them. It was Roger Williams who informed them that it was not the Narragansett, his allies, but it was a people further to the west known as the Pequot. And thus he saved both Massachusetts and the Narragansett from a devastating war, as the Narragansett would have been a far greater match for Massachusetts than the Pequot. Furthermore, it's known that Rogers convinced the Narragansett not to aid the Pequot in this war. You don't have to aid the English, just stay out of the drama. And again, he saved both the Massachusetts and the Narragansett from a potential conflict. He did this upon hearing news that the Narragansett were hosting a delegation of Pequot, knowing war was a-brewing. And he traveled some 30 miles by canoe in a storm overnight to arrive at a great council of Narragansett with the Pequot present. And through his pre-existing relationship with Canonicus, he convinced them not to join the war. As reward for his help early in the conflict, and eventually Rogers would help the English convince the Narragansett to aid them against the Pequot. And for helping to later end the war, Governor Winthrop rewarded Roger Williams with a Pequot boy to be taken as servant slave At the end of the war, most of the Pequot who couldn't find friendly refuge among another native neighbor were absorbed by the Mohegans under Chief Uncas, a great ally to the English. But the women and children of many of the prominent families were taken to the Puritan colonies to become servants, and thus the leading families of the former Pequot would be firmly under the Puritans' eyes and not among the natives. The young boy that Williams received, he would refer to as Will. He named him after himself. Will was the son of Mononnato, who was the brother of Sassacus, both great leaders of the Pequot. The Pequot boy Will's mother was being held as servant by the Winthrop family, and Roger Williams used Will to take messages from Providence to Massachusetts and back, where he could spend time with his mother and siblings, and also reaffirm the connection between Roger Williams and John Winthrop. Some sources will say that Williams saved Will from becoming a slave who would be sold off to the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, which often happened among native enemies that the Puritan colonies would capture. We'll see this in the later King Philip's War. You capture an enemy native, and then you sell them off to the Sugar Islands. Not only do you derive some profit from it, but then you also take an enemy and move them far, far away from you. And so again, some authors who are very charitable to Roger Williams will say that he saved young William from that fate. But let's dive into this relationship a little closer. Williams gave young Will the freedom to travel by himself and even see his family. Young Will never ran away. And in fact, at a certain point, he was given the choice to live again with his mother, and he chose to stay in Providence. And so what was Will to Williams is a confusing and hotly debated subject. The historical record does not fully indicate whether Williams perceived the young Pequot boy as a prisoner of war, a servant, or a slave. And so in many ways that Roger Williams was ahead of his time, this might be the one example where he fails to meet a modern standard. Although the interactions between the boy and Williams would suggest that they didn't have a slave owner-slave relationship such as you would see in the antebellum South. But nonetheless, there it is. Now let's turn to Roger Williams' religious mindset. As I've already said, he was a man who believed that government should be separated from religion, that there was a proper place in society for a secular sphere. But he was deeply religious, a reverend himself, an Anglican originally who moved toward the Puritan end of the spectrum, and then straight off of it into the separatist territory. But in Providence, by the year 1638, believe it or not, he became a Baptist. And he organized, with a few others in the town, the very first Baptist church in America. But it's known that Williams, within a year or two, had abandoned the Baptist faith. Then it's believed he briefly became an Anabaptist, the spiritual descendants of the Anabaptists you would know today as the Amish and the Mennonites. But he fell in and out of that faith even faster than he did with the Baptist faith. One could never meet Williams halfway, or agree with him in part. It was all or nothing. On top of Roger Williams being uncompromising, he was also a man full of doubt, not really sure of what was or was not in all things spiritual. William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation wrote that Roger Williams was a man godly and zealous, having many precious parts, but very unsettled in judgment. Roger Williams briefly gravitated toward the character of Anne Hutchinson, who was the most famous settler of Rhode Island, the Portsmouth colony specifically. And Hutchinson was always so very certain of what she believed or what she knew, where some people would think something, she would know it. And people who are lost, like Roger Williams, will gravitate toward the person who seems to know everything. And they had valuable conversations with one another, and both of them would end up at their own lonely endpoint, very similar in view, but in isolation. And Hutchinson, at the end, became pretty much a religion of one, and maybe some family members. And Roger Williams, too, a religion of one, having no church affiliation whatsoever later in life. To focus on Williams specifically, building on his earlier belief that Israel as a physical place and as an idea was dead, he came to realize that apostolic succession, in other words, the line of people from Jesus to his immediate apostles to their apostles, had long since broken and disappeared, and could not be reestablished until the return of Jesus. As such, any organized church is at best a guess, a man-made concept. He would turn to the Narragansett and the Wampanoag, and as he learned about their spiritual beliefs, found that these beliefs did just as much good for them as the Christian religion would do for the English. Whereas Anne Hutchinson would promote this direct spiritual connection to God, and thus not needing a church or a Bible or a reverend, Roger Williams went in the other direction, and at least for a time, saw the breaking of tradition in the intervening centuries as a complete disconnect from God that could only be reestablished by God himself.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.